Hello, everybody out there in listener land. This is Mayhem here with another edition of Random Fandom. If you've checked out some of my other videos and hung around my channel at all, you know that I primarily mostly deal in the fandom of comic books as well as a bunch of other stuff, but my number one love is comic books and comic book movies as well. So I had a couple of people requesting that I do a top 10 countdown of my favorite comic book movies of all time, so that's what this episode's going to be about. Going to give you my top 10 rundown of the best comic book films ever made. And just a little explanation right here at the top. It seems comic book movies would be a relatively narrow genre and there wouldn't be a ton to that particular list. But, you know, when you actually really think about it, there's a lot of movies that are based on comic books that you wouldn't necessarily think of as comic book films, like History of Violence or 300 or something, that are kind of like action movies, but not like Superman or superhero type comic book movies. So I'm not really including those type of movies in this. You could almost call this a top 10 superhero comic book film, but it's primarily going to deal in comic books that have the more traditional feel of heroes, protagonists, going against the bad guys. So that's the kind of list that you're going to see here. So starting off with number 10. Number 10 actually is going to be a twofer. I'm including two movies in this that I put right at the same level of awesomeness. I know what you're thinking, that makes this really a top 11 comic book movie list, doesn't it? Well, screw you for pointing out technicalities. It's my list and I'll do what I want. So coming in at number 10 is the teaming up of Blade and The Punisher. Blade, the first movie of the Blade Trinity, starring Wesley Snipes of the Daywalker, the half-vampire, who's in a one-man war against the vampire ranks that are moving through the shadows of the night. And with Punisher, there's been a few different Punisher movies. I'm going with the Thomas Jane Punisher movie. Now, the reason I picked both of these movies and put them together, aside from both being excellent movies, they do something that's a little bit off the wall when it comes to comic book movies. They are hyper-violent, R-rated comic book movies. It's almost easy to forget that those two characters in those two movies are actually based off of comic books, and not just kind of off-the-wall kind of comic books like Sin City was or anything like that. These characters are both in the mainstream Marvel universe. If you read the comics, both of these characters interact with the XMen or the Avengers or everything on practically a day-to-day basis. So it's really a more dark, gritty kind of comic book heroes, anti-heroes really, and it's the type of thing that they don't generally do too much in comic book movies. They tend to want to market them towards families and kids as well as older people and people middle-aged and older. So you don't see the hard R rating in comic book movies too often. So I got to give both of those films props for that, as well as just being terrific films all around. I think both Thomas Jane and Wesley Snipes captured both of those characters pretty well perfectly. Coming in at number 9, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the live-action film from back in the early 90s. This film holds a very special place in my heart because I was a young lad when this movie came out, and at the time that it came out, I was probably more psyched for it than any movie I had ever been psyched for before. I mean, I begged my parents to take me to see this movie, and once it was over and we left, I begged them to take me back the next day. I was a big-time Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fan when I was a kid. Now, in terms of quality, does the film really hold up? I think it does. It's okay. It's still worth going back and watching if it happens to be on TV, or I just feel like popping the DVD in. But my love for it really comes from a nostalgia standpoint of being a kid, and I remember the year it came out and being all about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and just loving that movie up and down. So that goes number 9. Number 8, a classic in the realm of comic book films, it's Superman 2. Richard Donner's masterpiece when it comes to the Man of Steel. I didn't really care for any of the other Superman movies too much. I think they all had some fatal flaws to them. Obviously, we can talk all day about everything that was wrong with Superman 3 and 4, but people still generally enjoy the first one. I couldn't stand the whole spinning the earth backwards in order to turn back time thing. As soon as that happened, I kind of threw up my hands and walked away from the screen. But Superman 2 was brilliant. It was a masterstroke, considering the technology they had to work with at the time in terms of CGI. It was really well done, and the acting on the part of Terrence Stamp played one of the all-time great villains in General Zod. So Superman 2 was back in a time when they didn't take comic book movies particularly seriously. And yet, this is still one of the greatest comic book movies of all time. So it really holds up throughout the years. Number 7, Iron Man. The movie that really started off the Marvel craze that we are still in, half a decade or more later. If you want to talk about an actor absolutely owning a role and playing it to picture perfection, it doesn't get any better than Robert Downey Jr. playing Tony Stark. He can pretty much make his career off of that character for the rest of his career, and he pretty well has. He just plays it so well, and I remember leading up to that movie coming out, when the casting decisions were first starting to be named and people were on the message boards wondering, who's going to play Tony Stark? Who's going to play Tony Stark? People were throwing out suggestions, and nobody ever suggested Robert Downey Jr. to play the role. The one I remember getting tossed out the most, and most people supporting, was Tom Cruise. And you think back now, it's like, what if Tom Cruise had gotten that role? It would have sucked. So Robert Downey Jr. was a choice that nobody was tossing out, nobody was thinking of. It was a very off-the-wall choice, especially considering Robert Downey Jr.'s past and his problems with drugs and not being able to hold his life together. It seemed like kind of an off-the-wall choice, but man, he does it absolutely perfectly. And he started the entire Marvel ball rolling. Him probably more than any other single person is responsible for all of the great Marvel movies we've been seeing ever since. Coming in at number 6, it's Hellboy. Now, here is a comic book that I would have said could never be made into a live-action movie and done well. You've got your main protagonist being something that I didn't think could be done without the use of CGI. But then they found the absolute perfect actor to play him in Ron Perlman. And they had the absolute perfect director for it too, in Guillermo del Toro. His sensibilities and his stylized way of shooting films lent itself perfectly to the combination of technology and magic and sorcery and legend that story of Hellboy utilizes throughout the entire run of the comic and then blended into the movie as well. I really loved the way Perlman played the character. I really loved the entire feel of that movie, as well as the second movie, The Golden Army, but I think the first one was the better of the two. Coming in at number 5 is The Watchmen. And with this one, I have a confession to make. I saw the movie before I had ever read the comic. Now, I know, as a comic book nerd, not having read Watchmen as one of the pretty well first things I read, I should have read it when I was like 10 or something, when I was first really getting into comic books heavily, but it was just one of those things. I didn't get around to it until I was into my late 20s, and really I saw the movie, and that made me go out and buy the comic afterward. Now, a lot of people have problems with the Watchmen movie, specifically people who read the comic first and then watched the movie. They didn't like the way the ending was changed. I like the way the ending was changed. Now, maybe that's from having watched the movie first and then reading the comic, but the way it was changed for the movie seems like a more crisp way to wrap everything up and gave Dr. Manhattan an even greater reason to leave Earth. Not just so much that he didn't so much care about Earth anymore, but he actually had to leave in order to sell this plan of Ozymandias's. So I actually enjoy the way they tweaked the ending, and then beyond that, pretty well everything in the movie other than that was almost identical to the comic. Some stuff was left out. That was just mainly for time's sake, because even with what they had, the movie tips the scales at like 2.5 hours. So I didn't mind them omitting a few things, but the stuff that was in there, the movie itself, was pretty well lifted directly out of the page, and I really loved the way Snyder did that and made it seem like it was almost a shot-for-shot remake of the book itself. All the actors in it did a fabulous job. The way it was shot, the way it was cinematography-wise, everything about that movie was really well done for me. And I think that movie gets a little bit of a bad rap because it didn't seem to really appeal to almost any audience very well. You know, the kids and family audience that went thinking they were going to see a superhero movie, a team of superheroes team up to take on the bad guy. They thought it was going to be a family-friendly film, and then they go and they see Blue Dong hanging in just like a couple of minutes of the movie. And oh no, that's terrible, and this isn't a movie for kids, especially with a bit of a downer ending. This certainly isn't a movie for kids. Well, it wasn't supposed to be a movie for kids. But then the hardcore fans were a little ticked off as well because of the way the ending was changed and some of the stuff that got left out from the comic. So it seemed like it just had a problem of being able to find an audience. But I guess I was one of those few people who were the right audience for it. I didn't have a hardcore love of the comic to where any alteration was going to damn it in my eyes. And I wasn't in the kids and family camp that absolutely insisted on it being family friendly as well. So I really liked The Watchmen, and it actually makes it into the top 5. It's my number 5 pick. Coming in at number 4, X-Men 2, X-Men United. In a franchise that has had some hits and has had some severe misses, this is one of the best comic book films ever put together. And it straddles a lot of difficult lines to straddle. It straddles a line of having almost too many characters. You could probably say it does have too many characters. In most comic book films, you've got one hero, one villain, you've got a couple supporting characters for the heroes, and a couple supporting characters for the villain, and that's it. X-Men 2, literally dozens of characters, and all of them having a vital function to play. And it gets to be very difficult for a movie to juggle that many characters and not become just too bogged down. Not enough exposition on any one character because there's too many to have to deal with. And this movie balanced it all very well. I think everybody got enough screen time. Everyone had good exposition for them. The plot was solid. The characters were well acted. Everything about this movie meshed together in harmony and did it perfectly. Now, it was something that they couldn't repeat in the later movies, but I think of the entire X-Men franchise, X-Men 2 is far and away the best, and it's good enough to make the number 4 spot on the top 10 best comic book movies of all time. Coming in at number 3, Captain America. I am a Captain America fan down to my core. He is my number 1 favorite comic book character of all time, hands down. So, when they announced that they were doing a Captain America movie, nobody was more skeptical about it than I was. You've got maybe the most difficult character to do live action-wise and make him believable. When you think about it, it's almost impossible to do Captain America really well because he'll come across as hokey. He'll come across as a cornball. How can you have a guy in the middle of World War II doesn't really have any superpowers to fall back on? You know, it's kind of easy to make Superman a Boy Scout character because nothing can hurt him. You know, he was taught to be a good person, and it's kind of easy for him because he never needs to take the easy way out because he's so powerful. But you've got a guy, Captain America, he's in the trenches of World War II, he's seeing the absolute worst of humanity, he has no real superpowers to fall back on, he's just a little stronger and a little faster than most. How is this guy going to maintain that kind of Boy Scout persona and not just seem hokey and cheesy as all hell? I didn't think it could be done. I didn't think there was any way they could do this movie and this character justice without it being a complete train wreck. I was 100% wrong. Chris Evans, I was not on board with him when they first announced him because in my mind, as well as in a lot of people's minds, he was the Human Torch from the Fantastic Four films. How can the wisecracking guy who's always chasing skirts and making cracks at other people's expense possibly be the Captain America? I was totally wrong about him. He embodied that character perfectly. He made him believable. He didn't make him cheesy. He didn't make him hokey. He didn't make him a sort of one-dimensional Boy Scout character either. He gave him depth, and he made it believable. So I love the movie. I love the way they played the character. I can watch that movie over and over again. It's probably my favorite of all of the Marvel films, Marvel Cinematic Universe films, at least in terms of the solo characters. Coming in at number 2, The Dark Knight. The second installment of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Another one of my all-time favorite characters in all of comicdom is the Joker. If Captain America is my favorite hero character, the Joker is my all-time favorite villain. Just so menacing and so horrendously terrifying, which is ironic because he has a clown persona. And a lot of different interpretations of Joker have existed over the years. And too many people, I think, fall back on the Jack Nicholson Joker as thinking he was the ultimate Joker. He was too funny to me. You know, I didn't particularly care for Batman, the 1989 Tim Burton Batman. It had some good parts, but especially when it came to the Joker, he was way too comical, and he wasn't menacing enough to me. I really like the kind of Joker who is in The Killing Joke. If you've ever read The Killing Joke, that's the Joker I like. The sadistic Joker. The one who will just absolutely torture you with your worst nightmares come to life. And is just vicious up and down, but laughs while he does it. That's the kind of Joker I like. And Heath Ledger brought that Joker out full force. I mean, this was not the happy-go-lucky Joker who's spraying acid in people's faces from his flower on his lapel. This was a Joker whose pockets were full of knives, and he carved smiles into people's faces with them. This was a brutal, sadistic Joker. And I loved him. I also love the plot of this movie because the plot of this movie was simplicity itself. You know, a lot of the problems I had with The Dark Knight Rises was Bane's plot was way too complicated. It was a giant Rube Goldberg device of a plan that should have fallen apart the first little hiccup that ever happened to it. Should have never even gotten out the gate. But Joker's plan was just absolute simplicity. He was just going to commit terrorist acts. He was going to blow people up. And if he wanted to make other people do his dirty work for him, he just threatened to blow them up. I mean, his plot at the end, you know, either the civilians blow up the convicts or the convicts will blow up the civilians. It didn't work out for him in the end, but that's a genius plot. I mean, if it had worked out for him, if the civilians had blown up the convicts, man, would he have gotten it over on Gotham City. So, it was well done. The characters were well acted. Of course, Morgan Freeman is one of the best actors of all time, so him being in there just lends gravitas and another great character to the movie. So that is a masterwork of a comic book movie right there, The Dark Knight. And you probably could guess number 1 coming in as my favorite comic book film of all time. It's The Avengers. Prior to this movie coming out, the naysayers were saying it's not going to be anything but Iron Man and his amazing friends. Iron Man was just going to be the sole focus and everybody else was going to take a back seat to him. And that wasn't the way it was done. That wasn't the way Joss Whedon did it. He made a very good balance of all the characters. Actually, Captain America ends up getting more screen time than any of the other characters, but only by like a minute or two. Every character was very well balanced in that movie. And it wasn't just let's get all these heroes together and have virtually no reason for them to do so, but just have them all get together to go and bust heads, and it's action for the sake of action and fun for the whole family. There was a very discernible plot in this movie, and it's spreading through into all the other films. I mean, it's a running thread through all of the Marvel films with Thanos and the Cosmic Cube, and it's something that's going to end up being played out over the next, 2 or 3 years worth of movies at least. So the plot's there, the villain, Loki. I almost put Thor on this list for Loki alone, because Tom Hiddleston as Loki is amazing. He's probably right up there with Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans in perfectly playing his character. But ultimately I decided that Thor wasn't quite on par with some of these other films, but as the bad guy in the Avengers, he's perfect. He does it to perfection. Hulk being in there for the moments that he is and getting the biggest laughs and being sort of almost the breakout star of the movie, even though he had the least amount of screen time in it. And then also not forgetting characters like Black Widow and Hawkeye. It's very easy for the non-powered characters to fall by the wayside and just be sort of there, but not have anything really to do. Black Widow had a lot to do. She was interrogating Loki and tricking him, and she was the stalwart member of the Avengers when all the other members were kind of breaking off and going their separate ways and having trouble working together. She was right there with S.H.I.E.L.D., helping him every step of the way. So it was a good mix of the characters, good plot, good villain. The action pace was heavy. I mean, even though that movie's over 2 hours long, it doesn't feel like it. I could watch that movie and just totally lose track of time because of how enjoyable it is. So it's thoroughly satisfying on absolutely every level. I can't really think of anything negative to say about that movie. Plus, it really delivers on the stuff that I want as a comic book nerd. I wanted a 3-way fight between Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. The trinity of the Avengers, the primary 3 characters, and Joss Whedon delivered on that. Somebody who wasn't a comic book nerd themselves might not have done that. Might have seen no reason for those 3 to fight in the woods like they did in the movie. But that's what the fans wanted. That's what any longtime Avengers reader is going to want to see, a fight between them before they end up teaming up. And it delivered. It delivered on every expectation I had, and everything I wanted to see was in there to some degree. So Avengers is, as far as I can determine, the perfect comic book film. And it takes the number 1 spot in my top 10 list. So there you have it. 10 through 1, or 11 through 1, as number 10 was a dual movie. So that is my list of the best comic book films ever made. That list might end up getting revised here in the next few years, as we're constantly getting more and more coming out all the time. I bet once Guardians of the Galaxy comes out, it's going to take a place on my top 10, because it's one of my favorite comics of all times, and I'm super psyched for it, as well as several other projects that are coming out soon. So, message me down below. Let me know what your favorite comic book films are. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you think anything on my list is absolute idiocy and you want to rag on me for it, hey, do that too. But let me know what you think down below, and I'll see everybody next time on the next episode of Random Fandom.